It's September 21st, 1327. The chill of Berkeley Castle's stone walls in Gloucestershire, England, presides over one of the most infamous and brutal murders in the annals of European monarchy. Within a dimly lit cell, a 43-year-old man lies, on a makeshift bed with his once vibrant eyes now dulled by despair. His wrists and ankles bear the raw, chafed marks of prolonged restraint, testaments to his recent past. His face, etched with profound humiliation and suffering, is a roadmap of his torment. This man, born into the highest echelons of royalty and groomed to rule an empire, is now merely a forgotten prisoner, stripped of all dignity and power. His name is Edward II Plantagenet, and just a few months prior, he was the reigning king of England. In the dead of night, two figures, their faces obscured by the shadows, stealthily enter his cell. They carry with them a medieval instrument of dread, a red-hot iron. What transpires next is a murder so utterly horrific, so deliberately and symbolically cruel, that its echoes would reverberate through the centuries, weaving themselves into the very fabric of historical legend. The deposed king is forcibly immobilized. A horn tube, crafted for a singular, unspeakable purpose, is cruelly inserted into his anus. Through this conduit, the scorching iron is then introduced, searing and destroying his internal organs without leaving any discernible external marks on his body. His agonizing screams, desperate pleas for mercy, are savagely muffled by pillows, ensuring that his final, tortured moments remain unheard by the outside world. The following morning, the former king's lifeless body is discovered. His face, a grotesque mask of unbearable agony, is contorted in a final testament to the torment he endured. The official proclamation, swiftly disseminated to quell any unrest, declares the cause of death as natural causes. This is the most widely disseminated, most dramatically embellished, and undeniably most shocking version of Edward II's demise. It is a narrative that has transcended mere historical account, evolving into a near-legendary tale that evokes the supreme horror of a tyrannical figure receiving a punishment that eerily mirrored his perceived sins, specifically his alleged homosexual relationships. But the critical question, one that continues to vex historians and fascinate the curious, remains: is this truly what transpired on that fateful night in Berkeley Castle? To unravel this enduring historical enigma, we must journey backward through time and delve into the intricate, often tragic, and undeniably controversial life of this ill-fated monarch. Edward was born on April 25, 1284, in Carnarvon, Wales, a strategically significant location. He was the fourth surviving son of the formidable and often feared King Edward I, famously known as the Hammer of the Scots, and Eleanor of Castile, his beloved queen. Edward's path to the throne was not initially predestined. He became heir only after the untimely deaths of his elder brothers. From his earliest years, it became strikingly apparent that the young prince possessed little in common with his stern warrior father. Edward I was a formidable military strategist, a calculating statesman, and a king who embodied the traditional martial ideals of medieval monarchy. His son, however, gravitated toward pursuits considered highly unconventional, even inappropriate. For a royal heir, Edward II found joy in swimming, rowing, engaging in various crafts, and, perhaps most controversially, seeking the company of individuals from lower social strata. Some chronicles of the era even recount his peculiar enjoyment of peasant labor digging ditches, repairing roofs, and forging metals, activities that starkly contrasted with the aristocratic expectations of his birthright. This profound rejection of chivalric ideals by his own son deeply incensed Edward I's contemporary accounts vividly describe the king's explosive rage, detailing how, in one particularly furious outburst, he tore out handfuls of his son's hair simply because the young prince had dared to request a noble title for his close companion. Piers Gaveston, a charismatic young nobleman from Gascony, had initially entered the royal household as the prince's appointed companion. Yet their bond swiftly deepened, transcending the conventional boundaries of mere companionship. The intense and increasingly exclusive relationship between Edward and Gaveston would become the focal point of the accumulating political and personal crises that would ultimately culminate in the future king's downfall and, ultimately, his untimely death. Upon the death of Edward I in 1307, his 23-year-old son ascended to the throne as Edward II. One of his very first acts as king was to recall Gaveston, whom his father had exiled in a desperate attempt to curtail his son's influence. Not only did Edward II bring Gaveston back to England, but he also bestowed upon him the immensely powerful and prestigious title of Earl of Cornwall, a dignity traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. To the profound consternation and outrage of the English nobility, Edward II went even further. He lavished Gaveston with the royal treasures he had inherited, and, in an act of unprecedented favoritism, allowed him to carry St. Edward's crown. During the coronation ceremony itself, an unheard-of privilege for anyone outside the direct royal lineage. The precise nature of the relationship between Edward II and Piers Gaveston has been a subject of fervent historical debate for centuries. Contemporary chroniclers, perhaps due to the social mores of the time or a deliberate choice of ambiguity, used terms that were open to interpretation. They described how the king loved him beyond all measure and how he had formed with him a covenant of constancy, binding himself with a bond of indissoluble love. Some historians argue that this seemingly effusive language simply reflected the prevailing chivalric ideals of profound, almost spiritual, male friendship that were common in the medieval period. Others, however, point to later, more explicit, accounts such as that of a bishop in 1334 who openly accused the late Edward II of sodomy, a medieval term that encompassed various non-procreative sexual acts, including homosexual relations. Regardless of the exact nature of their intimate relationship, Edward's overtly preferential and public behavior toward Gaveston proved to be a catastrophic political blunder. In 1308, seeking to solidify diplomatic ties, Edward II married Isabella of France, the young and intelligent daughter of the powerful King Philip IV, in a standard dynastic arrangement common for the era. However, the wedding festivities became a public spectacle of royal disregard. Edward, in a shocking display of insensitivity, devoted virtually all his attention to Gaveston, pointedly and utterly ignoring his new bride, adding insult to injury. According to contemporary accounts, the precious jewels that Edward had initially given to Isabella as a wedding gift mysteriously ended up in Gaveston's possession. The profound humiliation endured by the young queen, who was only 12 years old at the time, was a slight she would never forget, and it laid the foundation for a deep-seated resentment that would fester for years. The English nobility, already seething with resentment over Gaveston's undue influence, united under the leadership of the king's powerful cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. They relentlessly demanded Gaveston's permanent exile. Edward, pressured by the unified front of his barons, reluctantly yielded, only to defiantly recall his favorite shortly thereafter. This frustrating cycle of exile and recall repeated itself several times, each instance further eroding the king's authority and intensifying the barons' fury. The breaking point arrived in 1312 when the powerful barons, no longer willing to tolerate Gaveston's presence, captured him. In a brutal act of summary justice, they stabbed and beheaded him by the side of a road, sending a clear, bloody message to the king. Edward, utterly devastated by the loss of his beloved companion, swore vengeance. However, his weakened political position forced him into a temporary and deeply uneasy reconciliation with Gaveston's aristocratic assassins. Edward II's reign, even beyond the catastrophic Gaveston affair, was plagued by a litany of serious problems that highlighted his fundamental unsuitability for kingship. Militarily, he suffered a humiliating and decisive defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 against the Scots, led by Robert the Bruce. This catastrophic loss not only shattered English military prestige but also resulted in the permanent loss of vast territories that his formidable father had painstakingly conquered. Administratively, Edward proved woefully incompetent, allowing the royal treasury to be recklessly emptied through mismanagement and excessive favoritism, further alienating his powerful nobility and crippling the machinery of government. Politically, the king seemed incapable of learning from his past mistakes. After Gaveston's death, he repeated the same disastrous pattern of elevating another favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, to a position of extraordinary and unchecked power. The Despensers, both Hugh the father and Hugh the son, effectively became the de facto rulers of England, wielding immense influence over the king. They ruthlessly exploited their position to accumulate vast lands and wealth, crushing their enemies through a campaign of politically motivated executions and wholesale confiscations of property. Their rapaciousness and unchecked power bred widespread resentment throughout the kingdom. Queen Isabella, now a mature and formidable woman, found herself increasingly marginalized and relegated to a secondary, powerless role within the court. The Despensers, with their absolute sway over Edward, effectively isolated her from the king and any meaningful influence. This systematic humiliation and disempowerment cultivated within Isabella a deep, simmering, and ultimately deadly hatred, not only for the Despensers but, by extension, for her own husband, who allowed such egregious abuses to continue unchecked. The fragile political situation reached its inevitable breaking point in 1325. Isabella was dispatched to France on a diplomatic mission, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty. Once on French soil, however, she boldly and unequivocally refused to return to England as long as the Despensers remained in power. To make the already explosive situation even more volatile, the Queen, in a calculated act of defiance and rebellion, entered into a scandalous liaison with a powerful exiled baron, Roger Mortimer. Mortimer, a cunning and ambitious nobleman, who had dramatically escaped from the Tower of London and had sworn a solemn oath to overthrow Edward and his despised favorites. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched their audacious invasion of England with a comparatively small army. To Edward's utter astonishment and dismay, almost the entirety of the English nobility, along with the common people, rallied to their cause, receiving them not as invaders but as liberators from the tyrannical rule of the Despensers. The king and his detested favorites desperately fled westward, attempting to escape the inevitable. However, Their flight was in vain. They were captured. Hugh Despenser the Younger was subjected to a public execution of truly unparalleled brutality, a macabre spectacle designed to satisfy the pent-up rage of the populace. He was dragged by horses, then strung up from a gallows and agonizing 15 meters high, only to be cut down moments before death. He was then castrated, his genitals grotesquely burned before his own eyes. Next he was disemboweled, his intestines slowly removed and burned while he was, incredibly, still conscious. Finally, as a mercy, or perhaps the ultimate insult, he was beheaded. His severed head was then impaled and displayed on London Bridge as a grim warning. As for Edward, his fate, though less physically gruesome initially, was no less crushing. In January 1327, he was forcibly compelled to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. Initially, Edward II was held in what was considered relatively comfortable custody. However, in April of that year, he was transferred to the isolated and formidable Berkeley Castle, placed under the direct guard of Thomas Berkeley and two notorious figures, John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney. The conditions of his imprisonment quickly and deliberately deteriorated. According to various accounts, he was intentionally kept in unsanitary and demeaning conditions, reportedly forced to ride without undergarments to irritate his skin, and possibly subjected to intense psychological torture. The grim objective behind these degradations was painfully clear: to induce him to die of natural causes, thereby absolving Isabella and Mortimer of the direct guilt and political repercussions of regicide. Yet, Edward proved surprisingly resilient, clinging to life with a stubbornness that defied his tormentors' expectations. When it became evident that he would not succumb to natural causes as swiftly as desired, and with persistent rumors of daring rescue plots beginning to circulate, a fatal decision appears to have been made. On September 21, 1327, Edward II was allegedly murdered. This brings us to the pivotal and most hotly debated aspect of this harrowing story: what truly happened on that night at Berkeley Castle. The most widely known and horrifying version, that of the red-hot iron inserted through a horn tube, first emerged in chronicles written decades after the event. The most prominent of these sources is the Chronicle of Geoffrey Le Baker, penned around 1350, which describes in excruciating detail how Edward was murdered in a way that left no external marks, yet inflicted unimaginable internal pain. However, many modern historians increasingly question the veracity of this gruesome narrative. They point out that the hot iron story seems to have emerged as a deliberate piece of propaganda, likely propagated during the reign of Edward III, who eventually executed Mortimer and imprisoned his own mother. The sensationalized story would have served multiple purposes: to further demonize his father's murderers, making them appear even more depraved, and, crucially, to forge a symbolic and deeply damning connection between the method of execution and the king's alleged sexual activities, thereby justifying his overthrow and murder to a morally conservative public. If you're enjoying this royal rumble of history, why not subscribe? It's less painful than a red-hot poker, we promise. Some scholars argue that if Edward was indeed murdered, more conventional and equally effective methods would have been far more probable. Suffocation with pillows, for instance, would have achieved the desired result of leaving no visible marks, making it a highly plausible alternative. Others go even further, daring to question whether Edward truly died that night at all. An extraordinary alternative theory surfaced in 1333 when a mysterious letter, famously known as the Fieschi letter, was delivered to King Edward III. In this missive, an Italian cleric named Manuel Fieschi claimed to have heard the confession of the real Edward II years after his supposed death. According to this astonishing account, the king had managed to escape from Berkeley Castle with the corpse of a porter cleverly presented as his own. Edward then allegedly embarked on a clandestine journey through Europe, eventually finding solace and anonymity as a hermit in Italy. This theory gained a degree of traction when, in 1338, a man identifying himself as William the Welshman appeared at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor in Koblenz, boldly claiming to be Edward II. While most mainstream historians remain deeply skeptical of these sensational claims, a few respected scholars do consider the tantalizing possibility that Edward may have, against all odds, survived. What we know with certainty is that a royal funeral for Edward II was held in December 1327 at Gloucester Cathedral, where his elaborate and impressive tomb can still be visited today. The body, whoever it ultimately belonged to, was carefully embalmed, a process that would have made the identification of any specific trauma or the lack thereof exceedingly difficult. Edward III, upon consolidating his power in 1330, took decisive action. He executed Gurney and forced Maltravers into exile, effectively assigning blame for his father's death. The story of Edward II's brutal death, whether entirely true or embellished by later chroniclers, had a profound and lasting impact on English culture and political thought. Christopher Marlowe, the celebrated Elizabethan playwright, based his late 16th century tragedy Edward II on these very events, portraying the king as a tragic figure, a victim of his own personal passions and the ruthless political machinations of his enemies. Although Marlowe's play does not explicitly detail the method of murder in the text, subsequent Theatrical productions frequently include the chilling scene with the red-hot iron, firmly embedding it even deeper into the popular imagination and transforming it into a vivid historical meme. The case of Edward II holds particular significance because it represents one of the very first instances of the formal deposition of a crowned English monarch. It established a dangerous and revolutionary precedent that would be invoked and followed in subsequent centuries with other ill-fated kings, including Richard II and Henry VI among others. The radical notion that a king, divinely appointed though he might be, could be forcibly removed from the throne by his own people fundamentally challenged the deeply ingrained medieval conceptions of royal authority, which were believed to be derived directly from God. Moreover, the enduring association between Edward's sexuality and his tragic downfall established a powerful and persistent narrative that would be repeated throughout history. The idea that transgressive sexual behaviors among rulers inevitably lead to political disaster and moral decay. This potent concept, a form of historical moralizing, persisted in European culture for centuries, subtly or overtly influencing the representations and perceptions of other monarchs, such as James I of England and Henry III of France, who were also rumored to have homosexual relationships regardless of how Edward II actually met his end, whether through the horrifying brutality of the red-hot iron, by more conventional and less theatrical means, or even if he somehow managed to escape to live a life of anonymous exile. His story remains one of the most dramatic and poignant examples of the potential consequences of the profound conflict between personal desire and royal duty, between individual inclinations and the ruthless, unforgiving demands of medieval governance. Nearly 700 years later, Edward's magnificent tomb in Gloucester Cathedral continues to draw visitors, all fascinated by his tragic and enigmatic story. The eternal image carved in his alabaster effigy depicts a serene and majestic king, utterly devoid of any indication of the torturous end that tradition so graphically attributes to him. This striking contrast between the enduring stone dignity of the monument and the visceral horror of the legend is, perhaps, the most fitting epilogue for a king whose life was so profoundly defined by contradictions, a monarch who wielded absolute authority yet ended his days as the most powerless of prisoners, forever etched into history as a king both powerful and tragically fatally vulnerable. Don't let history remain a mystery. Make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more captivating stories from the past.